Maybe you've just experienced a panic attack, or maybe you've been diagnosed panic disorder, or maybe you just think you've had a panic attack and you don't really know what's happening. Well, you may be feeling really frightened and really confused. I know that from experience, and these are really natural things to feel. But one of the best things you can do to handle the situation is just to understand it. If you can educate yourself and understand what's going on, you have a lot more power over the situation. But maybe you're like me and you really like to know exactly what's going on. And you've tried to look through all the information out there, and while there's a lot of good information, there's also a lot of bad and conflicting information. It's hard to get through it all and figure out what's actually going on. So I wanted to make this video to officially say what is a panic attack, according to the latest science that's available. And before we get into that, I just wanted to say that I'm not a doctor. So the best way that you can get a handle on the situation and really make a recovery is to see a doctor. So please seek professional help. In this video, I'm going to cover what is a panic attack and why do we get them. So let's get into it. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, a panic attack is characterized by a sudden and intense feeling of discomfort or fear, and it usually peaks within a couple of minutes. And I just wanted to stress really how intense these things are. So when I was little, my mum used to suffer from a lot of panic attacks, and hers really seemed to be some of the most intense ones I've ever seen. But we would just be, relaxing, going about our business. Mum would be, making lunch for me before I went off to school. And then all of a sudden she'd be hyperventilating, she'd be sweating, she'd be really freaking out, looking really, really frantic. And she really, really believed that she was going to die. So these attacks are really intense. So let's take a look at the bigger picture. Anxiety disorders are really some of the most common mental illnesses that we all suffer from, along with depressive disorders. And within the broad term of anxiety disorders, there are heaps of other ones, such as social anxiety disorder, specific phobias, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety, and panic disorder. Now, panic disorder is characterized by a fear of reoccurring panic attacks. So you're always fearful that another panic attack is going to happen. You don't know when it's going to come. But let's take a look at the panic attack itself. So along with this sudden and intense fear that comes seemingly out of nowhere, there are also 13 other symptoms that we tend to experience. And for you to actually have what's called a panic attack, you would need to experience 4 out of these 13 symptoms. And I'm going to put a link down below, so if you actually want to read through it and see what all the symptoms are, you can take a look at that. And if you don't get 4 out of 13 of these symptoms, you might have what's called a limited symptom attack, which is something that usually occurs alongside anxiety disorders and panic attacks. Now, there are 2 types of panic attacks. There are expected and unexpected. And as the name suggests, the expected ones, you know when they're coming because there are specific situations that trigger them. It could be public speaking, or it could be going to a shopping center, or every time you have a certain conversation with somebody, you know when they're going to happen. Whereas unexpected, you have no idea when they're going to be happening. You could be completely at peace, completely calm, and then all of a sudden you experience these panic attacks. This brings us to the next big question, which is, why is this happening to me? And when we do experience these things, we can tend to get caught up in some really negative ways of thinking, such as, this shouldn't be happening to me. I'm strong and a confident person. Or even just, I'm not this kind of person. I shouldn't be suffering from something like panic attacks. Like, this is silly. And we really feel confused and frightened about what's going on. Things can get even worse when we tell our friends or our family and they don't really understand what's going on. You tell them and they say something like, "Oh, that's silly, like, just brush it off, you'll grow out of it. It's just a phase you're going through. You're just too stressed." And we feel even more ashamed because we can't just grow out of it. We really can't. And society kind of suggests there's a certain weakness attached to mental illness. which is really not true. And I wanted to stress this. Having a mental illness is not a sign of weakness. You didn't do anything to bring it upon yourself. It's just the hand that you've been dealt in life, and you just need to learn how to deal with it effectively and continue on with your life. I mean, that's it. But let's take a closer look at why panic attacks happen. A big part of it is stress. It can be major stressful events like being in a serious accident or losing someone that's really close to you, like a loved one. Or it can be just a buildup of stress. If you have a stressful job you've been going at for a long time, you're studying a lot, or it could be things like studying for your exams, having an assignment due in, moving to a new country. All these kind of things can create stress. Also, different kind of drugs can bring on panic attacks. But there's also a big portion of it that's genetic. So if you have panic attacks, it's not unlikely that someone in your family also gets them. And if it's not your parents, you might want to take a look further back into your grandparents, because sometimes these genes can skip a generation. So what does this mean? Does it just mean that if you have the genetics, that's basically it and you're always going to suffer from these things? Well, not necessarily. There's actually a really interesting area of science called epigenetics. And epigenetics pretty much suggests that certain genes can kind of turn on or off. And it's based upon the environment. So the environment can have a certain influence on your genetics. So it's not all set in stone. But a really interesting way to look at this is by something called the stress diathesis model. And basically this model explains how we develop mental illness and things like anxiety and panic attacks. And if you were to imagine two cups, and the height of the cup represents your threshold for developing panic attacks or any mental illness. And you could have a really short cup or you could have a really tall cup. And as more stress and more environmental factors pour into that cup like water, the chance of you developing some kind of disorder increases. But if you have the short cup, it's kind of like you've had a genetic predisposition. So if your mum and dad get panic attacks, your grandparents get panic attacks, you may have a really, really short cup, and it's a lot more likely, or it's a lot easier for you to develop something like panic attacks. But other people may have really, really tall cups, and they can go through all kinds of different environmental stress and they never really experience anything. So that's one way to look at it. Another really interesting way to look at this is from the evolutionary side of things. So there's a really great book by Dr. Jeffrey Kahn called Angst. And in this book, he suggests that panic is actually an evolved response. It's an instinct that actually once solved a really, really practical purpose when we were living in tribes. Basically, he says that when we were in tribes, if you got too far away from your tribe and you lost them and you couldn't get back, there was a pretty strong chance of you dying. You were cut off from food and resources and you were just out in the wild by yourself. So it's argued that we have this panic instinct so that whenever we got too far away from the tribe, we'd feel this distress and this fear and this panic and would make us go back to our tribe. And this evolved because if you did that, if you went back to your tribe, you survived. So basically it just says that panic did once serve a really practical purpose. It's not just something that's come out of nowhere and it's really maladaptive. There was a time when this really did serve a purpose. So to recap, panic attacks are these sudden and intense bursts of fear, and they happen really quickly. They last for about 10 minutes. You can take a look at the criteria and see if you actually experience what's called a panic attack, or maybe you have a limited symptom attack. And by the way, it's not a good idea to self-diagnose. It's a really good idea just to consult your doctor. Why do these things happen? Part of it's genetics, part of it's the environment, but you don't want to get too caught up in why it's happened to you. You just want to focus on what you can actually do right now and the steps that you can take to get over them. That's it for me. This is James from Mind Unlimited, and I'll see you next time.